Right, everyone. So question one, bullet one, just a reminder that question two was left out. So you'll see we've skipped question two, and then this gives you the theory in terms of each of the questions. So when we look at question one, the key bit to highlight there is that but they're the three pinnacles of the corporate social responsibility. And you can see those elements there, guys. Sustainability. And when we talk about sustainability, it's my silly definition of profits now, but also profits in the future. Accountability. Accountability is about if you mess up, you are the person who will accept full responsibility. It's your neck on the line, your job is on the line. And then transparency, and you'll remember when we spoke about transparency, it is the ability of a person outside the organization to look at its operations and be able to understand the operations. So those are very simple definitions. The detailed definitions are here. So from a sustainability perspective, it really is this notion of doing business in a way that will benefit current stakeholders, but with the key focus of making sure that we have the same resources available to benefit future stakeholders. So in terms of the natural environment, we've seen significant resources disappear, and that's simply because of unsustainable behavior. So from an organization's perspective, you want to make sure that you find a way of rolling over your resources. Remember my silly definition, the idea of profits now, but in a way that we have profits in the future. It's also about looking at your current stakeholders, but reminding yourself that there will be stakeholders in 10, 20, 30, 40, and further years down the line. So we don't try and use too many resources. I think one of the concerns at this stage is that as a planet, we use twice, 2.5 times the planet's resources. So we have one planet, but we consume 2.5 times the planet's resources. Accountability is really about your impact, and if it's when that impact is negative. So when we account, we are held liable for whatever we do. It's not about misdirection. It's not about being dishonest. It is accepting that you've had an impact, and then in terms of that impact, being held liable for whatever has happened. So from a responsibility perspective, in particular with leaders, we realize, oh, shucks, and this thing is changing size every time. My apologies for that. Is really the idea that we're part of this wider network. We're part of this broader reality. And in terms of that broader reality, as a good corporate citizen, we will have to make sure that our impact there is proper and decent, but also if it's negative, we will fix whatever mistakes we've made. So from an environmental perspective, it is making sure that we don't pollute. It is, if we pollute, taking actions to correct the pollution. It's not about misdirection. It's not about dishonesty. It is saying, I am liable. I will fix because I caused the problem. In terms of transparency, my simple definition of the ability of an external person to look at our operations and see what we're actually doing from the outside. So it really is about reporting the truth. It is about making sure that we don't greenwash things. But also in terms of this, guys, it really is that even those individuals that don't have a detailed understanding of what we do should be able to have a glance at our operations and understand what aspects of those operations essentially link together in providing products and services, but also how those impact communities, how those impact the natural environment, and how those contribute to profits and profitability and ultimately dividends for our shareholders. My apologies for having to just make these bigger. So for bullet two, it's the idea of the deontological ethics theory, and it really is to look at Coca-Cola and in some of its behaviors, discuss the ethicality of that. Now remember, this is bullet two. So when we look at the deontological approach, is really the fact that we look at the impact, we look at the potential impact, but it's not about fixing the impact. It is about looking at those actions contributing to that impact and in a proactive way, dealing with our own issues and realizing that if we impact, the impact should be positive. So the focus is, yes, we realize that we'll have an impact, but the truth is we consider our actions in terms of arriving that. And so we look at the cause and we try and reduce the impact of the causes. So I think the reality is that it's about deciding between right and wrong. And again, we know that when we have the kind of technologies that we have, when we have the kind of interactions we have, that there's a reality where something can be illegal and ethical, but something can also be ethical and illegal. From a deontological perspective, it really is about making sure that from an ethics perspective, we do the right thing. And then from a legal perspective, we have a positive outcome in terms of our behaviors. So, in terms of the various justice theories, I think the first one is that it's about doing good, but protecting people from harm. It's that line that you'll often see in advertising that says, do no harm. The positive rights theory is that our focus here is that we look at the rights of communities. So there's certain rights in South Africa entrenched in our constitution, in our Bill of Rights, and we stick to those rights. We tick box that we do not transgress in terms of those rights. From a social contract perspective, I think it really is about law and order. And when we look at societies where law and order has gone out the window, I think then we realize we have a society in trouble. So what we try and do is we make sure from a legal perspective that we adhere to the variety of pieces of legislation that apply to us, and whether it is employment equity, whether it is stuff around health and safety, whether it's stuff around environmental issues, we make sure that in terms of our contribution to the social contract, we will make sure that we adhere to legislation. And then the social justice theory, right, is really to look at the distribution of social benefits. And in South Africa, from a social justice perspective, I think sometimes it is an unjust society because 10% of the people pay 90% of the tax. But the reality, in terms of where we've come from an apartheid perspective, there has to be some sort of compensation. And therefore, from a social justice perspective, it's absolutely acceptable to have affirmative action policies which will benefit people who were previously disadvantaged at the expense of people who we would consider were previously advantaged. Right. And then we look at the legal context for sustainability, guys. Yeah, just remember to highlight the bits that I suggest. When we look at the definition of sustainable development, again, it's this idea of protecting the environment in such a way that we'll have environment in the future. So it's about natural resources. It's about ensuring that we do business in a positive way where we actually try and prevent impact in terms of the natural environment, where we don't simply just deplete resources and make profits as a consequence of depleted resources. It is about recycling. And one of my examples that I use, which is a little bit silly, but if one of SAPI or Mondi cut down trees in a particular area, they plant trees or they plant saplings in another area. So again, it is about making sure we have trees now, but done in a way, and trees for celluloid or something, I don't know how to pronounce it, or paper, but also making sure that we have trees of the future when we plant those saplings. In terms of some of the more modern definitions, and remember, it's that transition to the triple bottom line. And I said a couple of times in class that if you don't know what to write, just write triple bottom line. That combination of looking after the interests of communities. Remember, people, planet, profit. In this instance, it is people. The second one is profit from an economic perspective, looking after the interests of our shareholders. And then from a natural environmental perspective, looking after the planet as well. And it really is about taking decisions that positively impact this so that we now look at those three elements, but in a way that we are ensuring a future. So in terms of the piece of legislation in South Africa that will impact, there shouldn't be a surprise at any of these. The first one, the Natural Environment Management Act. Again, we know that there are protected areas, there are wetland areas, and it's about respecting those areas. And again, the focus very much about making sure that we don't pollute and we don't destroy. Other pieces of legislation you can see here, my apologies. The Labour Relations Act, Employment Equity Act, and you'll see triple BEE, all of those related to making sure from an employee perspective that we transform our organizations to reflect the realities of our environment. You can see some of the others, Croatia, their Promotion of Access to Information Act. I think the manual is a little bit old, so POPI would be popped into there as well. See what I did there? And in terms of looking after in people's private information, you've got the Water Act and then the Companies Act. Companies Act, key in terms of promoting people looking after the interests of shareholders. Remember, it's about the notion that the board of directors have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders. Guys, and then, the King report, and I know it's not mandatory, but this is a set of guidelines specifically developed for South Africa in terms of promoting good governance. And it has significant indices related to governance and then people, planet, and profit. Right, so that is question 1, I think. Question 2, we skip. Guys, do you want one recording or must I split the recordings? Can we split the recordings? Okay. So remember question 2, not doing. I'm sitting in class actually talking to you, so I'm not talking to myself while you listen to this thinking,